The moment Wesley Sheridan saw the woman stepping down from the stagecoach with a carpetbag in one hand and a flour sack bulging suspiciously at the seams in the other, he knew his quiet life was about to be interrupted in ways he had not yet imagined. The town of Caldwell, Kansas, sat pressed against the southern border of the state like a man leaning against a fence post, half exhausted and half watchful, and in the autumn of 1878, it was a place where cattle drives still kicked up red dust along the main street, and where a man could go weeks without anyone asking him a single personal question. Wesley Sheridan liked it that way. He was 29 years old, broad across the shoulders and lean everywhere else, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar because he kept forgetting to ride into town for a proper cut, and he had been running his ranch, a modest but well-kept spread of land he called the Double S, for 4 years without anyone telling him what to do about it. He had a good horse named Canyon, a barn cat named General Sherman who earned his keep, and a bunkhouse with 2 reliable hired hands named Colt and Big Amos who minded their own business. His life was orderly. His life was manageable. His life was, in a word that he would have used with complete sincerity had anyone asked, fine. Then Hester Hayes stepped off that stagecoach. She was 26, the younger sister of his old trail-riding friend Dale Hayes, who had written Wesley a letter 3 weeks prior that Wesley had read twice, and then folded into his shirt pocket where it had lived, crumpled and warm ever since. Dale had written that his sister was going through a hard stretch after the death of their mother back in Missouri, and that she needed a change of scenery, just a week or so out on the plains where things were simpler, and the air was clean, and maybe a person could breathe again without the weight of grief pressing down so hard. Wesley had written back that she was welcome. He had figured on a quiet week. He had figured she would sit on the porch, rest up, and then climb back onto the next stagecoach heading east. He had not figured on Hester Hayes. She was not what he expected, though he realized now that he had not spent much time forming an expectation. Dale was tall and easy-moving and slow to speak, and Wesley had assumed a family resemblance that went deep. But Hester was of medium height with a quick way of carrying herself, dark auburn hair pinned up with a practicality that suggested she had pinned it up herself in bad light and simply moved on, and eyes the color of good river water, which is to say a green that went dark in shadow and lit up in sun. She was wearing a traveling dress the color of dusty sage, which seemed appropriate, and she was looking around Caldwell's Main Street with an expression that was not the soft overwhelm of a city woman encountering the frontier for the first time, but something more like assessment. She was taking the measure of the place, and she was doing it efficiently. Wesley crossed the street toward her, lifting his hat as he came, which was the proper greeting and also bought him a moment to collect himself. "Miss Hayes," he said, "I'm Wesley Sheridan. Your brother wrote to me." She looked at him directly, which he appreciated, because some women of that era did not, having been taught it was too forward, and he found that kind of careful indirectness exhausting. "I know who you are," she said, and her voice was clear and a little lower than he had expected, not unpleasant at all. "Dale talked about you. He said you were stubborn and fair-minded and that your biscuits were terrible." Wesley looked at her for a moment. "The biscuits have improved." The corner of her mouth pulled. It was not quite a smile, but it had the intention of one. "I'll form my own opinion," she said. He took her carpetbag. She held onto the flour sack. He did not ask about the flour sack. He led her to where Canyon was hitched, and he helped her up into the wagon seat, and they rode out of Caldwell toward the Double S in the long horizontal light of a late October afternoon, the prairie rolling out in every direction like a breath held, and then slowly let go. For a while neither of them said anything, and the silence was comfortable in the way that silences between people who have no history can sometimes be, because there was nothing yet to be careful about. Then Hester said, "How far is your place?" "About 6 miles," he said. She nodded, watching the land. The grass was going golden with the season, the sky enormous and lavender-tinged at the edges where it met the horizon, and a small hawk circled far out to the south, riding nothing but warm air. "It's bigger than I thought it would be," she said. "The land." "Yes," she paused. "Dale said it was empty. I don't think he meant that as a criticism." "I didn't take it as one," Wesley said. "There's different kinds of empty. Some of it's lonely and some of it's just open. This is the open kind." She looked at him sideways. "You've thought about that?" "I've had time," he said simply. She settled back and watched the prairie unfurl, and neither of them said anything more until they turned up the lane toward the Double S, where the ranch house sat low and solid against the evening sky, lamplight already glowing in the front window because Big Amos had gone ahead to get the place warmed up. Bless the man. The ranch house was not grand. It was built of good Kansas timber and stone, and it had a front porch that faced west, which meant it caught the sunset every evening like a painting nobody had ordered but everybody stopped to look at. There was the barn, the bunkhouse, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, and a root cellar. There was a well with good water and a kitchen garden that had gone fallow for the season because Wesley had not gotten around to it. The bare turned earth behind the house where last year's vegetable patch had been, now just dark soil going to sleep under the autumn chill. Hester stood on the porch with her carpetbag at her feet and looked at that bare patch of ground for a long moment after Wesley had introduced her to Colt and Big Amos, who were both respectful and brief because they were good ranch hands and good ranch hands read a room, or in this case a porch, correctly. "What was in that garden?" she asked, nodding toward it. Wesley glanced at it. "Beans, mostly. Some squash. Tomatoes that didn't do much." "Soil looks good," she said. "It is good soil," he agreed, and he held the door open for her and showed her to the spare room, which was small but had a good quilt on the bed and a window that faced east so it would be bright in the mornings. He made supper that night, which was salt pork and fried potatoes and cornbread that was decent if not inspired. And Hester ate with appetite and did not complain, and said the cornbread was better than Dale had led her to expect, which Wesley decided to take as a genuine compliment even if it was a backhanded one. After supper she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and Wesley sat across from her, and the lamplight was warm between them, and he thought about her brother writing that she needed to breathe again, and looking at her now he understood what Dale had meant. There was something behind her eyes that was tired in a way that sleep did not fix, the specific exhaustion of grief, which is not really about rest at all but about carrying something heavy and not knowing where to set it down. "Your mother," he said, and then felt uncertain about going further. She looked at him steadily. "She died in August," she said. She had been sick for a while so it wasn't a surprise, but those kinds of things aren't ever really not a surprise when they arrive. "No," he agreed. "I lost my father 2 years back, felt like walking off a step I knew was there and still managing to fall." Something in her face softened, not into weakness but into recognition. "That's exactly it," she said quietly. The lamp flickered. Outside, a coyote ran a long note across the dark, and another answered from farther off, and the sound drifted through the kitchen walls and neither of them found it frightening, which was perhaps one small thing they had in common. She went to bed early, as people do after long travel and long grief, and Wesley stayed up with his coffee and the letter from Dale still in his shirt pocket, and he thought that a week was a very short amount of time, and then he thought that was a strange thing to think and he put it away and went to bed himself. In the morning he rose before the sun because ranch work did not care about the time of year, and he had fed the horses and split a cord of wood, and was starting on a fence that needed mending along the north pasture when he came back to the house at 8:30, and found Hester not sitting on the porch resting, as he had imagined she might spend her mornings, but standing in the kitchen garden with her boots on and a stick in her hand, and she was marking lines in the dark soil. He stopped at the gate and watched her for a moment. She was measuring something, stepping off distances, and the flour sack from yesterday was open on the ground beside her, and he could see now what was in it because some of its contents had spilled, which were seed packets. A good number of seed packets, more seed packets than a person visiting for a week would have any sensible reason to bring. "Miss Hayes," he said. She looked up, her hair slightly wind-blown where a piece had come loose from its pin. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "I hope you don't mind." "I couldn't sleep past 6. "What are you doing?" he asked, because it seemed a reasonable question. "Planning," she said, as if that also were a reasonable answer, which in fairness it was, just not the one he had expected. She looked back down at the soil. "This bed is south-facing and the soil is deep. You could put in a winter garden and get ahead of spring. Garlic right now, onion sets, maybe some winter spinach under cover if you have any cloth to spare." He walked up to the fence gate and leaned on the post. "It's late October. Garlic goes in the fall," she said. "That's the whole point of garlic. The cold helps it establish." She looked up at him with those river-green eyes and added, "I won't make a mess of anything. I'll do it tidy." Wesley Sheridan had not asked anyone's permission on his own land in 4 years, and the last time he had done so, he had been 25 and still finding his footing. But he looked at Hester Hayes standing in his fallow garden with her stick and her seeds and that small determined set to her shoulders, and what he said was, "All right." She smiled then, the real one, and it did something to the morning air that Wesley told himself was just the sun coming properly over the horizon. He went about his work, she went about hers. By midday she had put in 2 rows of garlic along the southern wall where the heat would collect, tucking each clove in with a care that reminded him somehow of the way a person folds a letter before sliding it into an envelope, intimate and private and precise. She had also turned and raked the rest of the bed, and laid in a long row of onion sets, and 3 shorter rows of something she told him at lunch was spinach, which would need a frame of cloth over it to get through the cold nights. "I don't have any cloth," he said. "I noticed," she said. "Have you got old flour sacks?" "In the barn." "That'll do," she said, and she went back out after she had eaten. He watched her from the barn door while he was working on a piece of harness that needed stitching, and he was aware that he was watching her in a way that went beyond simple curiosity about what she was doing, and he made himself look back at the harness with a firmness that he applied to most things in his life. By the 3rd day, Hester Hayes had not only finished the garlic and the onions and the spinach, but had also transplanted a scraggly rosemary bush from a pot on the porch to a sheltered spot by the south kitchen wall, where, she informed him over supper, it would winter better because the stone would hold heat. And she had discovered the old cold frame rotting in a corner of the barn, and had asked Colt, with a smile that appeared to render Colt temporarily incapable of saying no to anything, to repair it. And Colt had spent an afternoon repairing it, and had said afterward to Big Amos that the woman had a way of asking that made a man feel like the repair had been his own idea. Big Amos had said that was called charm, and he said it with the particular respect of someone who recognized quality craftsmanship of any kind. Wesley had not said anything about this, but he had watched the cold frame take shape in the garden, and he had felt something stirring in him that was not irritation, though it had some of the same energy as irritation, the way a river looks the same from a distance whether it is running fast or slow. On the evening of the 3rd day, he sat on the porch after supper and Hester came out and sat in the other chair, the one that nobody had sat in since his father had come to visit 3 years ago, and spent 2 evenings on it before the journey back to his family in Abilene, and the chair had sat empty since, which was a thing Wesley had never examined too closely. The sky was doing its sunset performance, which in Kansas in late October was considerable, all orange and deep rose and a thin edge of green at the very horizon that appeared briefly and then was gone, like a secret told and then taken back. "I want to apologize," Hester said. He looked at her surprised. "For what?" "For running away with your garden," she said. "I do that. When I need to do something and I'm not sure what to do, I find dirt and I do things to it. My mother called it my particular remedy." Her voice was steady, but there was something under it. "She had a kitchen garden our whole lives. I used to help her in it when I was small, and then when she got sick this past year I kept it going because she couldn't, and after she passed I couldn't go back to it. It was hers in Missouri. But this one is nobody's yet. She looked at the freshly worked bed in the evening shadow. I hope that's all right. Wesley was quiet for a moment. The last color was leaving the sky, going to purple and then to the deep navy that preceded stars. It was my father's land before it was mine, he said finally. When he gave it over to me, he said the land doesn't belong to any of us, really. We belonged to it for a while. I figure the same could be said about a garden. She looked at him. He was looking at the sky, and he felt her looking, and he let himself glance over and meet her eyes, which in the fading light were darker, like deep water, and he was struck by the particular quality of her attention, the way it was complete and undivided, as if he were the only thing in the landscape worth looking at, and no one had looked at Wesley Sheridan quite like that in a very long time. Dale said you were fair-minded, she said softly. Dale talks too much, he said, and she laughed, the first full laugh he had heard from her, and it broke the solemnity of the moment into something warm and easier. And they sat together on the porch until the stars came out and the coyotes began their evening conversation, and neither of them went inside until it was genuinely late. On the fourth morning, a rider came up the lane at a pace that meant either news or trouble, and since it was a man Wesley recognized as Pete Granger from the town's hardware supply, and Pete was not the sort given to drama, Wesley put his coffee down and walked out to meet him. Pete had news that was not trouble exactly, but was the kind of thing that required attention. There was a question of a property line along the eastern edge of the Double S, a survey dispute that had been simmering since the summer, and that the county land office in Caldwell was now insisting needed to be addressed before the year was out. 2 other ranches were involved, the Miller operation and Old Beaumont's place, and there would need to be a meeting at the land office within the next 2 days. Wesley thanked Pete and watched him ride back, and then he turned to find Hester standing on the porch with her coffee, having appeared there soundlessly and without ceremony as he was beginning to understand she did most things. A land dispute, she said. You have good ears, he said. I wasn't trying to listen, she said, though she did not look particularly apologetic about it. Is it serious? He came back up the porch steps and picked up his own coffee from the rail where he had set it. Could be. If the survey goes the wrong way, I lose about 40 acres of east pasture. She frowned, not with distress but with the focused consideration he was already recognizing as characteristic of her. Do you have your original deed? In the house? Is there anything in it about benchmarks, survey markers? He looked at her. You know about property deeds. My father had a farm dispute when I was 12, she said. I listened. He wanted on a boundary marker description that the other party's surveyor had gotten wrong by 3 chains. She paused. It matters what kind of marker was used. Wesley thought for a moment and then said, Come look at the deed with me, which was not something he would have said to most people, but Hester Hayes was not most people, and he was beginning to accommodate that fact at a rate that was probably faster than was strictly sensible. They sat at the kitchen table with the deed spread between them, Hester reading with the kind of careful attention that a schoolteacher might give a difficult text, and she found it inside of 15 minutes. The original boundary on the eastern edge referenced a natural landmark, specifically a particular limestone outcropping that a cursory reading would miss, but which Hester pointed to with a finger and said, There, that's your fixed point. If that outcropping still exists, your east line doesn't move. Wesley looked at the passage and then he looked at her. That outcropping is still there, he said. I ride past it every month checking cattle. Then you have your argument, she said. 2 days later, Wesley rode into Caldwell for the meeting at the land office, and he came back in the afternoon with his east line intact and 40 acres of good pasture confirmed as his own, and he had in his saddlebag a piece of maple candy from the general store that he had bought on impulse without entirely examining why, and he handed it to Hester when she came out to meet him, and he said, The deed held. Her face went bright and open. I knew it would, she said. It was your reading that found it, he said. The thanks belong to you. She took the maple candy and looked at it and then at him, and something moved across her face that was more than the transaction of a gift, something quiet and warm and surprised. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know," he said simply, and he led Canyon to the barn, and he was smiling in there where she could not see him, and General Sherman, the barn cat, witnessed it and said nothing, having more discretion than most. That evening Hester made supper, which was a thing she had been doing as often as Wesley, the two of them having fallen into a rhythm in the kitchen that had arrived naturally and without discussion, the way water finds its level without being told to. She made a beef stew with onions from town and dried herbs, and it was the best thing Wesley had eaten since his mother had last cooked for him, and he said so. "You're easy to feed," she said, pleased. "You'll eat whatever is put down. Most things are worth eating if they're made with care," he said, and he was talking about the stew and also not only about the stew, and he suspected from the slight color that came to her cheeks that she understood this and chose not to address it directly, which was all right. Some things were better arrived at slowly. The week, which he had thought of as a clear and obvious unit of time with a defined beginning and end, was on its 5th day, and Wesley Sheridan had stopped thinking about its end with any kind of relief, and had started thinking about it with something more like the feeling a man gets standing at the edge of a cliff he did not know was there, until he was already standing on its edge. On the 5th morning, Hester appeared at the breakfast table with a piece of paper on which she had drawn a diagram. Wesley poured coffee for both of them and sat down, and she slid the paper across. It was a garden plan. Not the winter bed she had already planted, but a full plan for the spring, with sections marked for vegetables and one corner marked for what she had labeled kitchen herbs, which included several things he could not identify by name. There were notes in her careful, small handwriting along the margins. Plant dates. Companion planting suggestions. A note about the east side getting afternoon shade from the barn and which plants would prefer that. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked up at her. She was watching him with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not entirely succeeding, because her hands around her coffee cup were gripping it slightly tighter than was necessary for a comfortable morning beverage. "You've been planning this for a while," he said. "I had time in the evenings," she said carefully. "Miss Hayes," he said, and he paused, not to be difficult but because he wanted to say this correctly, and he was a man who sometimes needed a moment to locate the right words. "A woman who brings an entire flour sack of seeds on what she described as a week's visit, who plants a winter garden in the first 2 days, who starts planning spring before the week is out, is not, in my experience, a woman who is thinking about leaving after a week." The silence stretched. Outside, a horse moved in the paddock and the chicken coop was producing its usual morning sounds, and the wind was low and from the south. Hester looked down at her coffee. Then she looked back up. "I may have," she said slowly, "had a thought that perhaps if the place and the situation suited, the visit could be extended." "Extended," he said. "I wasn't entirely sure you would mind," she said, and then with more honesty than he had expected, she added, "and I wasn't sure enough to ask outright, so I planted things." "You planted things instead of asking," he said. "Things that would need tending," she said. "Things that couldn't be left." He sat back in his chair and looked at her across the table. This woman with the river-green eyes and the flour sack full of seeds, and the kind of quiet determination that had, in 5 days, remade his fallow garden into something that lived and would keep living through the winter. And he thought about the other chair on the porch that had been empty for 3 years, and how it had not been empty for 5 evenings now. And he thought about supper, and the deed, and the maple candy, and all the small, unremarkable things that had somehow stacked up into something he was not ready to let leave on a stagecoach. "Miss Hayes," he said again, "I think you'd better tell me what you were thinking about this situation. Plain." She set down her coffee cup. She smoothed the garden plan with one finger. "I was thinking," she said, "that I have been in Missouri my whole life and that everything I love there is buried in it now, and that the air here is very clean and the soil is very good, and I have not felt like I could breathe properly in 6 months, and then I came here and I could." She met his eyes. "And I thought that if a place makes a person feel like they can breathe, maybe that's worth paying attention to." Wesley was quiet. Then he said, "The place or the people in it?" The color in her cheeks deepened. "I'm not sure you can separate them," she said softly. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I think you should stay." She blinked. "For longer than a week." "For as long as you want," he said, "which I suspect, if the spring garden plan is any indication, might be a considerable while." A smile broke over her face so completely and so suddenly that it was like a lamp being lit in a room. And then she seemed to notice she was smiling that broadly, and she looked back down at the garden plan with an expression of great concentration that was entirely unconvincing. And he watched her and felt something in his chest that had been shut tight for a long time open quietly, like a door on a still day, without any particular sound. "Someone should write to Dale," she said. "I'll write," he said. "You've got a garden to tend." She laughed, and the morning was good. The weeks that followed were ones that Wesley would later remember with the particular vividness that belongs to periods in which a person is being changed without fully knowing it. The change comes in layers, in increments, in the accumulation of small, ordinary things that only reveal themselves to be extraordinary when you look back at the whole of them together. Hester wrote to a woman she knew in Jefferson City, Missouri, asking for seeds of a specific heritage tomato variety that the woman's family had grown for 3 generations. The letter came back with a full packet enclosed, and a note saying that she was glad they were going somewhere they would be cared for. Wesley carried the packet to Hester, where she was working in the barn with Colt on an irrigation plan for the spring garden, because the well's distance from the south bed was going to require some engineering, and he handed her the packet, and she took it with both hands like something precious, and she said, "These are my mother's tomatoes." He did not say anything because it did not seem like a moment that required words, only presence, and so he stayed standing there in the barn doorway while she held the seeds and looked at them and gathered herself back together. And after a while she looked up and said, "Thank you for bringing this to me." "I was coming to the barn anyway," he said, which was not entirely true, but it gave her the smaller version of the thing, and she accepted it with a look that suggested she understood the larger version perfectly well. November brought cold and then colder, and the prairie turned brown and silver, the grass going the color of old straw, and the sky came down low and gray, and there were days of hard wind that rattled the window glass and drove the cattle into the low ground by the creek for shelter. Wesley spent long days on horseback, riding circuit, checking fences, and Hester was never idle. She had taken over the root cellar organization with the same methodical care she brought to the garden, and she had begun helping with the accounts, because Wesley's account keeping was, she observed carefully, brave rather than accurate, and he had let her at the ledger because she was right and also because he liked watching her work, the way she moved through numbers with a confidence that was brisk and clean. One morning in mid-November, he came back from a long day's ride to find Hester at the kitchen table, not with the ledger but with a letter, and the letter was folded in her lap, and she was looking at the stove. Her expression was the one she wore when she was processing something that had weight to it. He sat down across from her and said nothing, waiting. "Dale wants to know," she said, without looking up, "if I'm planning to stay permanently, because if I am, he thinks I ought to have a clear situation." "A clear situation," Wesley said. "He means," she said, looking up now, "that he is my brother and he wants to know what my circumstances are, and he is asking it in the way that a man of this time asks such things, which is to say with considerable delicacy around what he actually means." Wesley considered this. "What does he actually mean?" "He wants to know," she said, with a directness that he had come to expect from her, "whether there is an understanding between us, or whether I am simply living in your house, which he points out would be, if it continued indefinitely, a matter for comment." The kitchen was warm from the stove, and outside the wind was pushing at the house, and the lamp on the table made a small, steady circle of light, and they were inside it, both of them. And this was their ordinary evening, and Wesley was aware with sudden clarity that it was the thing he wanted most in the world to keep being true. "Dale is right," he said. She looked at him carefully. "About which part?" "That it wants to be clear," he said, and he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, which was the boldest thing he had done toward her and also felt like the most natural thing he had done in years. "Hester, you came here for a week and you planted a garden before the week was out, and I think we both know what that means about how long you intended to stay." She looked down at his hand over hers. "I didn't plan it quite that calculatedly," she said, but she did not move her hand. "I know," he said. "I think you needed somewhere to plant and you found somewhere that felt right, and I think you were also hoping that something else might feel right, and I think it did. Did it?" The fire in the stove ticked. The wind pushed. The lamp held its light. "Yes," she said quietly. "Then let's do this properly," he said. "I'm not much for long speeches, and I figure you know that about me by now, so I'll say it plain. I would like very much for you to stay, Hester, not as a guest and not with any unclear situation. I'd like you to stay as my wife if that's something you would consider." She looked at him for a long moment, and he held still under the look, not rushing it, because she deserved the time to give it the weight it required. Then she turned her hand under his so that their palms were together, and she said, "I would consider it favorably." He felt something shift in the room, or perhaps in himself, as if something that had been waiting a long time had quietly finished its waiting and arrived. He smiled, and it was not the small, careful smile he gave mostly to other people, but the real one, the one that reached his eyes and stayed there, and she saw it, and something in her own face went open and warm in return. He wrote to Dale that night, and the letter was 3 paragraphs long, which for Wesley Sheridan was a very long letter indeed. Dale wrote back within 2 weeks, which given the distances of Kansas mail was practically immediate, and what he said was that he was glad, and that he would come for the wedding if they gave him enough notice, and that he was not in the least surprised because he had sent his sister to a good man's ranch knowing full well what she was like with a garden, and what she had done to every fallow piece of ground she had ever found in her life. And if Wesley had any sense, he would know what it meant when a woman planted things in your soil, and it appeared he had that sense, which was exactly what Dale had counted on. Wesley read this letter twice, and then folded it into his shirt pocket where Dale's first letter had lived, and he said nothing about it to anyone, but he wore an expression for the rest of that day that Colt noticed and reported to Big Amos, who said that was what a man looked like when he had figured out that everything was going to be all right. The wedding happened in December of 1878, in Caldwell's small Presbyterian church on a Saturday morning when the sky was high and blue and brilliantly cold, the kind of cold that makes the world look cut from glass. Hester wore a dress of deep green wool that she had made herself in the preceding weeks with a practicality that Wesley found moving, that she would make her own wedding dress with her own hands and do it well. Dale Hayes arrived 2 days before on the stage from Missouri, taller than Wesley remembered and with more gray at his temples, and he embraced his sister for a long time on the porch of the Double S, and Wesley gave them that time by going to the barn and staying there longer than was strictly necessary. At supper the night before the wedding, Dale sat at the kitchen table and watched his sister and Wesley Sheridan move around each other in the kitchen with the ease of people who have worked out the geography of a shared space, and he drank his coffee and said nothing about it, but he was watching with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has arranged things and seen them unfold correctly. At the church, Reverend McAllister, who was a small man with a large voice that had seen a good many frontier weddings and did not rush through them on that account, performed the ceremony with proper gravity, and also with the small, warm humor appropriate to the occasion. Colt and Big Amos attended in their best shirts. The postmaster and his wife attended because they knew everyone's business whether they were invited to be involved or not. The woman who ran the dry goods store came with her daughter and sat in the third pew and was visibly moved at the vows, which was not unusual for her. When Wesley said, "I will," his voice was steady and quiet and meant, and when Hester said it, hers was the same, and they looked at each other during the saying of it with the full directness that had been there from the first morning on the main street of Caldwell, when she had met his eyes without deflection, and the directness felt now like the through line of everything. He kissed her once properly in front of everyone. Dale, from the front pew, covered his mouth with his fist and looked at the ceiling in the way of a man managing his emotions with his last remaining tools. They had a supper at the Double S that night, a real one, with a ham that Big Amos had been smoking since the day before, and corn pudding and dried apple pie that Hester had made that morning, and they pulled the kitchen table outside into the cold where there was more room and put lanterns along the fence, and it was cold enough to see your breath, but nobody left early, and even General Sherman, the barn cat, sat on the fence post with his tail wrapped around his feet, and observed the proceedings with the dignified approval of someone who had watched the whole story develop from the beginning and found the conclusion satisfactory. Dale left the following Tuesday on the morning stage, and he stood on the porch of the Double S in the blue early light and held his sister's hands and said, "You look like someone who has found where she belongs." Hester said, "I think I have." "It's the garden," he said, with a smile that was also not entirely joking. She put her arms around him and held on, and over her shoulder Dale looked at Wesley and gave a small nod that contained within it the entire contents of a letter he had once written and sent, and never doubted for a moment. Wesley nodded back. There was nothing else needed. Winter settled deep and full over the Double S, and inside it two people learned the particular and daily art of being married, which is not dramatic most of the time and is better for it. They learned each other's rhythms in sleep, and in the morning and at the table. They learned that Wesley was slow to rise and quick to laugh once he was properly awake, and that Hester was alert the moment her eyes opened, but needed quiet around that alertness for the first hour. They learned that he was inclined to fix things silently, and she was inclined to plan things out loud, and that these tendencies, while occasionally producing friction, were more often complementary, a balance that made the whole operation of the ranch and the household run with a competence that surprised even Colt, who was not easily surprised. The winter garden came through. The garlic pushed green tips up through the frost, as Hester had said it would, and the spinach under the cloth frame survived 2 hard freezes and produced enough for the table through February. Wesley ate it without comment, which for him was the equivalent of a standing ovation, and she understood this and was pleased by it. In January, Wesley rode to Caldwell and came back with a small package that he handed to Hester at the kitchen table without preamble. Inside was a pair of leather-work gloves, well-made, sized for smaller hands with her initials pressed into the cuff. HS, now, Hester Sheridan. She put them on immediately and held her hands out to look at them and then looked at him, and she said, "Wesley," in a voice that had something in it too large for the small kitchen, and he said, "For the spring," and they left it there, which was the right place to leave it. Spring came the way spring always comes to Kansas, tentatively at first and then with conviction, the cold retreating in fits and the grass greening in patches, and the wind shifting from north to south and warming by degrees. By March the cottonwoods along the creek were hinting at leaves, and the meadowlarks were back, those bright yellow birds whose song in the morning was like the plains congratulating itself on surviving another winter, which it had, as it always did. Hester's spring garden went in with the methodical care of someone who had been planning it through 4 months of cold weather. The heritage tomatoes from Missouri went in under a protective glass from a broken window pane that Colt had repaired into a useful cold frame, each one planted with the seriousness appropriate to something that carried a specific weight of memory. The other beds went in organized and planned, and Wesley, who had been walking past the fallow earth behind the house for 4 years without giving it much thought, now found himself stopping at the fence gate and looking at the emerging rows with a satisfaction that he recognized as entirely borrowed from his wife, which was all right. Some of the best things a person felt were borrowed that way. One warm evening in April they were both in the garden, Hester weeding and Wesley repairing the fence gate that had been stiff all winter, and the light was the long golden kind that makes the most ordinary things look considered, and Wesley looked over at his wife in her garden with her new leather gloves on her hands and the green going in all directions around her, and he said, "You know, I did think you were visiting for a week." She looked up from the weeding. Her hair had more sun in it than it had when she arrived in October. The green of the garden behind her and the green of her eyes were not the same green, but they rhymed. "I know," she said. "And then you went and planted half the territory before the week was out," he said. "I planted a winter garden," she said with precision. "It was quite modest." "Hester," he said in the tone he used when he was about to be honest, "you had a spring plan drawn up by day 5. She pressed her lips together. "I like to be prepared." "You knew you were staying," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him, and there was no apology in her face, but there was warmth, a great deal of warmth. "I knew I wanted to," she said. "There's a difference. I needed to know that the place wanted me too." He let go of the gate and walked the 3 steps across the garden path to where she was kneeling, and he reached down and she took his hand and he pulled her to her feet, and they stood together inside the green and growing thing she had made of his fallow ground, and he said, "The place wants you. I want you. I expect that is thoroughly established by now." She put her hands on his chest and looked up at him. "Thoroughly," she said. He kissed her there in the garden in the April light, with the meadowlarks going in the pasture and the tomatoes coming up in their careful rows, and it was not a dramatic kiss. It was a long, quiet one, the kind that belongs to people who have already agreed on all the important things and are just now acknowledging that agreement directly. That summer was a good one by any measure. The rains came in decent intervals, and the cattle did well and the garden did better. The tomatoes from Hester's mother's seeds produced fruit of such depth and color that Big Amos declared, having tasted one off the vine in a moment of enthusiastic permission-taking, that he had never in his life eaten a tomato that tasted like it knew something. Hester laughed when Wesley reported this to her, and she brought in a full basket and made a sauce that she put up in jars, and the kitchen smelled for 2 days of tomatoes and bay, and something else she said was black pepper, and which she had developed an opinion about the correct amount of, which was more than Wesley would have used and also exactly right. There was a difficulty that summer, not a large one but a real one, and it came in the form of a man named Harlan Bright, who had a claim on a piece of water rights along the creek that fed the Double S's southern pasture. The water rights question in Kansas in the late 1870s was a serious matter, because water in the prairie was not abundant and was the difference between cattle that thrived and cattle that did not. Harlan Bright was not a dishonest man, but he was a determined one, and he believed his prior claim on the creek water gave him the right to divert a portion of it in dry periods for his own use, which in a sufficiently dry period would affect the Double S significantly. Wesley rode to discuss it with Harlan twice. The second discussion was less polite than the first, and he came home from the second one with a set to his jaw that Hester recognized, and so she did not ask about it immediately but waited until supper was done and they were on the porch in the evening, and then she asked. He explained the situation and she listened, and then she said, "Is there a prior written arrangement about the creek?" "Not in writing," he said. "It was understood." "Then it needs to be in writing," she said. "Not as a challenge to Harlan Bright's rights, but as a clarity for everyone's. Go to the county and propose a formal water agreement. Set the terms on paper. Men like Harlan Bright are not always unreasonable. They're just uncertain, and uncertainty makes people grip harder than they need to." Wesley rode to the county seat in Wichita the following week, which was a longer ride and required an overnight, And he came back 2 days later with a water rights agreement drawn up by the county recorder that was fair to both parties and which Harlan Bright, when it was presented to him, signed after reading it carefully, because it turned out that Hester was right about the nature of the difficulty. Wesley told her so that evening, and she said, "I'm glad," and did not make more of it than that. But later, when he was writing up the ranch accounts and she was reading by the lamp, she looked up and said, "You know you could have handled that without me." "I know," he said. "Then why did you ask?" she said, not challenging him but curious about him. He thought about it. "Because two heads on a problem this ranch's size makes more sense than one," he said. "And because your particular head works in a way that catches things mine misses. That's not weakness. That's sense." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at her book, but the smile was there. "Fair-minded," she said to the page. "Dale was right about that one." By the time the harvest came in September of 1879, nearly a full year after Hester Hayes had stepped off the stagecoach with a carpetbag and a flour sack, the Double S had a full root cellar, a kitchen garden that had produced beyond anything the land had been asked to do before, a repaired cold frame, a working irrigation channel that Colt had built along Hester's plan during the summer, and a marriage that had the particular quality of things that have been planted and tended, and have grown in the specific direction the soil of a place requires. Hester showed Wesley the garden one evening in late September, walking him along the rows in the cooling air, telling him what had done well and what had not, and what she planned to do differently for next year. She talked about the soil quality and the drainage and the tomatoes and the garlic that was now in its second year in the ground and would be stronger for it. And she talked about wanting to put in a proper arbor for climbing beans along the south wall. And she talked about possibly getting some herbs she had been corresponding about with a woman in St. Louis who specialized in kitchen remedies. Wesley listened to all of it, and he said, "How long have you been thinking about the arbor?" "Since February," she admitted. "In February we had 18 inches of snow," he said. "The arbor does not care about the snow," she said reasonably. "I care about the snow. The arbor is a spring thought that I was having early." He shook his head, but he was smiling the real smile. "Hester Sheridan," he said, "you are the most planful person I have ever in my life encountered." "Is that a criticism?" she asked, with the cocked eyebrow she used when she was not actually worried about the answer. "It is the opposite of that," he said. She took his arm as they walked back toward the house through the garden. And the evening was the soft, warm kind that comes in Kansas at the end of summer as a sort of final gift before the cold, all amber light and long shadows. And the house in front of them, with its lamplit windows, was a picture that neither of them looked at without feeling something particular, because it was theirs in the full and complicated sense of belonging that goes past property and into something about identity and choice. In the spring of 1880, Hester told Wesley that they would be having a child in the autumn. She told him in the kitchen, in the morning, over coffee, in the matter-of-fact way that was distinctly hers but which he recognized now had underneath it the full depth of feeling she carried and expressed mostly through action rather than declaration. She said it, and then she watched him with those green eyes and waited. Wesley set down his coffee cup. He looked at her. He looked at the table, and the ledger she had been working on, and the lamp, and the window and the light coming through it. And then he looked back at her, and what he felt was something too large for any word he knew but which moved through him like weather, like those Kansas storms that come across the prairie with everything they have. And he stood up from the table and came around it and took her face in both his hands and said, "Hester," in a voice that had nothing left to hide in it. She put her hands over his, and her eyes were bright with something held carefully at the rim. "I know," she said softly. "I know." He held her there for a long moment, in the kitchen, in the morning light. The summer of 1880 was the best the Double S had seen in several years. Wesley had added 12 head of cattle to the herd in the spring, and they were doing well. And the garden was in full, magnificent production. The tomatoes and beans and squash and the herbs along the south wall all going at once. and the arbor that Colt had built along Hester's design was now fully planted with a climbing bean variety she had sourced from a seed catalog, and which was producing abundantly. Visitors to the Double S, and there were more of them now than there had been in Wesley's bachelor years, because Hester had a talent for making people feel welcome that operated without apparent effort and brought people back, often remarked on the garden with genuine surprise. A working cattle ranch's kitchen garden was not unusual, but a kitchen garden of this particular ambition and order was something else. Mrs. Granger, Pete's wife, who came sometimes with Pete when he delivered supplies, stood at the garden gate one afternoon in July and said, "Hester, I don't believe I have ever seen such tomatoes in Kansas." Hester, who was considerable with child by then but moving through the garden with characteristic efficiency, said, "They're from Missouri, heritage seed. You have to earn their trust." Mrs. Granger looked uncertain about how one earned the trust of a tomato, but she nodded as if this made complete sense, because Hester Sheridan had a way of saying things that made them sound inevitable. Wesley was watching from the porch, and he felt the particular pride that belongs not to accomplishment of your own, but to witnessing someone you love being entirely themselves in the world, fully and without adjustment or apology, and being recognized for it. The baby came in October of 1880, almost exactly 2 years after Hester had stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell. He was a boy, and he arrived with the thoroughness and determination that seemed to be a family characteristic, and Hester got through it with the same matter-of-fact quality she brought to everything, which is not to say it was easy, because it was not, but she came through the other side of it in the early morning hours with that focused look she always had after a difficult thing was completed, the look that said she had taken the measure of it and done what was required. Wesley sat beside the bed where she lay with the baby, who was very new and very serious-looking in the way that new people sometimes are, as if they are already thinking hard about the world they have just arrived in, and Wesley held his wife's hand and looked at this small, serious face and felt the full weight of his life, which was considerable and which was, unmistakably, good. "What shall we call him?" Hester asked. Her voice was tired, but her eyes were clear. "I thought maybe Dale," Wesley said. "If you think that's right." Her eyes went soft. "Dale James Sheridan," she said, trying the full version. "James was my father's name." "Then that's what it is," he said. She looked at the baby and then at him and said, "Thank you, Wesley." He did not ask for what because he understood she meant it generally, which was how he received it. Dale Hayes made the journey from Missouri in November to meet his nephew, and he sat with little Dale James on his lap by the kitchen stove with an expression of great pride and some bemusement, and he said to Wesley, "He looks like Hester around the eyes." "He does," Wesley agreed. "He's going to be trouble," Dale said. "All the best people are," Hester said from the stove, where she was making the coffee. Dale looked at his sister and then at Wesley, and he said, in the simple tone of a man making a true statement, "I think this is exactly right." "Yes," Wesley said, "it is." The years that followed had the quality of good years, which is not to say they were without difficulty, because the frontier never entirely permitted that, but they had the quality of being met together, which makes the difficulty different. The winter of 1881 was hard, and the cattle took losses, and they rebuilt. There was a grasshopper plague in the summer of 1882 that took most of the garden, and Hester replanted what she could and ordered seeds early for the following year with a determination that brooked no argument from any grasshopper past or future. There were good cattle markets and lean ones. There were seasons when the rain came right and seasons when it did not. Through all of it, Colt and Big Amos remained, those two steady, good-natured men who had seen the whole of the change the Double S had undergone, and who considered Hester Sheridan one of the finest bosses they had ever worked for, which they expressed mostly by working harder than they were asked to, and occasionally by bringing her things from town she had mentioned needing, as if the whole ranch were quietly conspiring to make her project succeed. When Dale James was 2, Hester told Wesley there would be another child. This time he lifted her off her feet, which surprised her, because he was not habitually demonstrative of large emotion in that particular way, and she laughed with the full startled joy of someone who has been surprised by exactly the right thing. The second child was another boy, born in the summer of 1883, and they named him Thomas for Wesley's father, who had passed, and who Wesley had loved with the uncomplicated depth that good fathers earn from their sons. Thomas was a different kind of person from his brother from the first, quieter and more watching, a trait he shared with his father that Hester recognized and treasured. By 1884, the double S had grown. Wesley had bought the 40 acres on the eastern edge that had been under dispute 6 years earlier, when the Miller family had moved on and offered it at a fair price. The herd was larger, and the operation required 2 additional hired hands, brothers named Ira and Samuel Vance, who were competent and decent, and fit into the double S's particular culture of hard work and reasonable expectation without much adjustment. The garden had also grown. What had started as a winter bed and a spring plan had become, over 6 years, something that visitors genuinely made mention of: a substantial and productive kitchen garden with the arbor, the herb border, the established garlic plot now in its 7th year in the same ground and growing stronger annually, and the raised frame that Hester had added in 1882 for the seedlings she started every February. Because Kansas springs were changeable, and seedlings needed a head start against the cold. There were also now 2 fruit trees, a peach and a pear, that Hester had planted in 1881 in a sheltered spot by the east wall, and that had survived their first hard winters and were now producing, the peach particularly enthusiastically. In the summer of 1884, when Thomas was 1 and Dale James was 3, and had developed a deep personal relationship with General Sherman's offspring, because General Sherman himself had departed the world in 1882 at a great age, with dignity, and had been replaced by a younger cat named simply the General, who was training his own successors. Wesley stood one evening at the garden gate while Hester was doing what she did in the evenings when the boys were asleep, which was to walk the rows and check on things. It was a habit that had not changed in 6 years and that he still found moving, the simple specific quality of her attention to growing things. He watched her stop at the tomatoes, which were in their summer fullness, those same Missouri heritage tomatoes that had been coming here now since the first year, always started fresh from saved seed, her mother's tomatoes carried forward year after year in the Kansas soil. She put her hand on a full red fruit and held it there for a moment without picking it. He came through the gate and walked down the row and stood beside her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She looked at the tomato and then at him. "I was thinking," she said, "about the flour sack." He said nothing, waiting. "I packed it the night before I came," she said. "I sat in my mother's room in Missouri in the house where we'd all grown up, and I went through her seed tin and I took what I thought I could use, and I told myself it was just in case." She smiled a little. "Just in case the soil was good, just in case there was room." "And was there," he said. "Room?" She looked up at him. "More than I knew how to fill at first," she said. "And then the right amount. And then," she said, with a look at the full abundant garden around them, "exactly this much." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood in the garden in the evening light, the Kansas prairie going wide and golden around the fence, the 2 fruit trees casting long shadows on the east wall, the tomatoes at their ripest, the garlic bed already put in for the year, the herbs along the south wall going fragrant in the warm air. "Wesley," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to need to expand the herb section next spring," she said. "I want to put in chamomile and lavender along the outer edge." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How much room?" "Another 6 feet along the fence line," she said. "That'll take out the fence post at the corner," he said. "I'll move the post," she said. "You'll have Colt move the post," he said. "Colt will be happy to move the post," she said. "Colt will move the post because you'll ask him with that particular way you ask things," he said, "and he will believe he came up with the idea himself." She pressed her lips together in the way she had when she was trying not to be too obviously amused. "The chamomile will be useful for the boys," she said. "Thomas has had that difficult stomach." "Is that why you want it, or is it a justification?" he said. "Oath," she said immediately, and he laughed and she laughed. And out in the pasture the horses moved in the long evening light, and somewhere across the dark flat distance a coyote started his call, the same sound that had come through the kitchen walls on the very first night, on an evening that had been the beginning of everything. And it was still the same prairie and still the same night sounds and the same enormous Kansas sky, but nothing else was the same at all. And that was the right outcome, the only one that made sense. In the morning, before anyone else was up, Hester was already in the kitchen. Wesley came down the stairs at his usual hour to find coffee on the stove and a sketch on the kitchen table, a careful diagram of the expanded herb border, with the moved fence post marked in a different color of pencil, and the chamomile and lavender laid out in their rows. He picked up the diagram and looked at it, and then looked at the stove where his wife was pouring coffee, and he thought about October 1878, and the woman stepping off the stage with a flour sack full of seeds, and how he had thought she was visiting for a week, and how the week had not yet ended before she had put her hands into his earth and begun the slow, irrevocable process of belonging to it, and how that process had extended itself, as such things do when they are planted in good ground, into everything, into the ledger and the deed and the water rights and the kitchen and the porch and the other chair, and the two small boys asleep upstairs, and all the mornings and evenings and difficult winters and good summers that made up the whole of a life shared. "The lavender placement is good," he said. She turned from the stove with both cups of coffee. "I thought you'd say the fence post was the problem." "It is the problem," he said, "but the lavender placement is still good." She set his coffee down in front of him, and she leaned over and kissed the side of his face, quickly and warmly, the way she did in the mornings, which was one of those small particular things he would not have been able to describe to anyone else as significant, but which was entirely significant, the specific daily language of them. "Colt can move the post on Thursday," she said, sitting down across from him. "I'll tell him," he said. "I'll tell him," she said serenely. He looked at her over his coffee cup. She looked back over hers. The lamp was lit between them on the table, the way it had been on the first night, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the Kansas morning was beginning, the light coming up from the east in long pale lines across the prairie, the same light that had been coming up over this land since long before either of them had arrived on it, and that would keep coming long after, but which right now in this hour was coming up for them. "Hester," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm glad you brought the seeds," he said. She smiled, and it was the one from the first morning, the one that did something to the air, and she said, "I know you are." And she meant it simply, and he took it simply, and the morning came in full, and the coffee was good, and the garden was out there waiting in the early light, already planning its spring. Dale James came down the stairs at a rapid pace that suggested he had been awake for some time, and was now committed to making sure everyone else was too. And Thomas came after him in the slower, watchful manner of a boy who was still deciding what the day was going to require of him, and the kitchen filled with the particular noise and life of small children in a home that was built for them. And Wesley lifted Thomas to the chair, and Hester set out the morning things, and the four of them were at the table in the lamp-warmed kitchen, while the Kansas day built itself up outside, and it was full and present and entirely, unreservedly good. The chamomile went in the following spring, and the lavender and the fence post was moved by Colt on a Thursday as agreed, and Big Amos helped, and both of them reported afterward that it had been their own idea, and this was simply how the double S worked, and everybody knew it and nobody minded. By 1886, the herb border had extended itself further still, because once chamomile and lavender were established they invited additions in the mind of a certain kind of gardener, and Hester Sheridan was unambiguously that kind, And the kitchen garden of the Double S had become a thing that people in Caldwell and beyond had heard of, because good things travel in a territory where the distances between places makes everything worth knowing get known quickly. A woman from 2 ranches over came to ask Hester about her cold frame technique for starting seedlings, and Hester spent an entire afternoon explaining it and sent her home with a packet of the Missouri tomato seeds, because a good variety deserved to be in more than one garden. Wesley watched this from the barn door, the way he had watched things from barn doors and porch rails and gate posts for 8 years now, and what he felt watching his wife give away those seeds, which she had saved and carried and tended across state lines and through several years of Kansas weather, was a love so straightforward and complete that it did not require any embellishment or analysis. It was simply there, the way the prairie was simply there, enormous and sustaining and without apology. That evening the boys were in bed and the house was quiet, and they sat on the porch in the last of the daylight, the 2 chairs side by side as they had been every evening for years, and Hester said, "She's going to do well with those tomatoes. She has good instincts." "You can tell that from an afternoon," he said. "I can tell from how she held the seeds," she said. "The careful ones hold them differently." He believed her because she was right about these things more often than she was wrong, which was an occurrence in itself fairly rare. "You gave away your mother's tomatoes," he said. "I kept plenty," she said, "and they're not only my mother's anymore. They've been growing in this soil for 8 years. They're ours now." She paused. "The things we tend long enough become ours, and then we can give them away." He turned his head and looked at her in the evening light. She was looking at the garden, which in the blue hour before full dark had a settled, deep quality that was very close to beautiful. She had lines now at the corners of her eyes from squinting in the sun, and her hair had more gray in it than when she had arrived, though not much, and her hands in her lap had the specific quality of hands that work in soil, clean but knowing. She was 34 years old, and she was the landscape of his life, the fixed point by which he took all his other measurements, and he felt this with a clarity that required no examination. "Hester," he said. "I know," she said without him saying anything further. "You always do," he said. "You're not difficult to know," she said. "You say what you mean and you mean what you say, and you have since the first day." He thought about the first day, the main street of Caldwell, the lifted hat. "They'll talk too much, and I'll form my own opinion." "You've thought about that," she had said, and he had said, "I've had time," which was true then and less true now because his time was no longer his alone, and he had not had a single moment's wish for it to be otherwise. 8 years, he said. "Almost exactly," she said. "And you still have seeds left in that flour sack," he said, because she did. She had told him once that she still had a portion of the original seeds from her mother's tin that she had not planted yet, keeping them against some future use she had not yet determined. She smiled. "I'm waiting for the right moment," she said. "Some seeds are for later." "What are they?" he asked. "Morning glory," she said. "My mother grew them along the fence. I was never sure what to do with a working ranch fence, whether it was the right place for morning glory." He looked at the garden fence along the south edge, the solid wooden rail that had been there since he had built it in his first year on the Double S, repaired several times but fundamentally unchanged. He thought about morning glory climbing it in the summer, those deep blue flowers that opened in the early light and closed in the afternoon. His mother had grown them too back in Abilene along the yard fence when he was a boy. "Plant them," he said. She looked at him. "There. Wherever you like," he said. "It's your fence too." She was quiet. Then she said, "They'll spread." "That's what things do when you give them room," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and there was in her face everything she had ever felt, compressed into a look that was private and completely hers and completely his, and she said, "Wesley Sheridan." "Yes," he said. "I am very glad I brought those seeds," she said. "So am I," he said. "So am I." The morning glory went in along the south fence the following spring, pressed into the warm soil by her hands on a morning in May when the Kansas sky was enormous and blue above them, and Dale James, who was 7, helped her plant, pressing each seed in with great solemnity. And Thomas, who was 5, observed from the fence rail with the evaluating look of a judge, and Wesley leaned on the gate post as he always had, watching. And the seeds went in one by one along the fence line that ran the south edge of the garden that had started as a fallow patch of dark earth, and had become, over the years, the growing heart of the double S, tended and loved and given room to spread. By June the morning glory was climbing. By July it was covering the south fence in a wash of deep blue that opened every morning in the early light, those wide petals the color of summer sky, and closed again by noon, their daily offering complete. Hester would come out in the early mornings to see them open, sometimes alone and sometimes with one or both of the boys, and occasionally with Wesley, who found that he had developed, without noticing the transition, the habit of rising a little earlier on summer mornings, which had nothing whatever to do with ranch work and everything to do with standing beside his wife in the blue flower light. The prairie went on in all directions, vast and constant, the way it always had and always would, and the double S sat in the middle of it, solid and worked and alive, and the garden behind the house was in full summer abundance, and the morning glory was open in the early light, and all of it, every growing, blooming, bearing, tenacious thing, had begun with a flour sack of seeds and a woman who had come for a week and planted a garden before the week was out, and stayed for the rest of it, which was the whole of a life, and which was exactly, precisely, irrevocably enough.